Meanwhile, a few days previous, Frederick had taken some long overdue leave from the secret tow center to travel and broaden his mind, if not his stomach, finding himself among the prodigious Inca ruins, with the likes of Indiana Jones, perusing ancient glyphs and drinking in the scenery. Back at his hotel, while napping and dreaming in his comfy poolside lounge chair, Frederick chanced to pick up upon several whirlpooling premonitions that had eddied back into a small vortex of the future, past remembered, in a vision. One such concerned a critical and crucial clue concerning his insight of the theory of separation of fundamentals versus unification, the natural inclination, but one that was standing still, that led him onward to thoughts about some relevance of his old and nearly forgotten papers still back at his abandoned apartment condo complex. Another, more of a nightmare, showed mushroom clouds. The third, somehow related to the first, was of some general danger lurking about his vacated residence. Frederick was torn, but he needed those documents back, for the tow center, to refine the theory of everything in time to prevent the flooding of the earth. For now, both of the ice caps were 1/3 melted and gone. On the spur of the moment, Frederick flew to Northern California, carrying only his emergency bag. Much of Southern California had been ablaze for months now, and recently a cyclone had killed 150,000 people in Myanmar, and earthquakes had sown in many more in China, as well as did a record number of tornadoes that had swept across the central United States. He waded through the haze of a city that still bustled, even in its wee hours, entering his old complex without much ado, having noted no one about at the rear, and headed for his storage locker near the laundry room, for this is where he kept his vault of information, not trusting it to his apartment or to the internet. It was all there. He sorted out the important papers and was off, a faint scent of gas quickening his pace away from the danger zone. Frederick soon lost himself for concealment in a mini crowd of drunks waltzing down the street, catching a dim vision of a vaguely familiar face quite a ways behind, one that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps the street wasn't the place to be, he wondered as he headed for the Muddy Waters Cafe. All were startled to hear an explosion about 2 blocks behind, Frederick noting that it had centered on his apartment. Something was certainly not right about this night, but how? Who? He'd used a tow-approved alias on the flight and had done some plastic surgery on his real credit card, cutting it in half so he couldn't possibly use it. Everyone outside stood and stared while Frederick entered the cafe and ordered a warm cup of chai to soothe his nerves. What the heck was going on? He placed his papers in a trash can for protection just as the chai arrived. He and the documents should be safe here for a time until the people outside began moving about again. After drinking of the elixir for a while, he held his head in his hands, not quite knowing what to make of this, for the CIA and the FBI were now on his team's side, and the dwindled conspiracy had been lying so very low as to perhaps be nearly non-existent. Plus, there had been his stealth.
What happened next had not been seen in his dream. As Frederick looked up, there was none other than that unplaced face approaching, that of KGB General Burkov appearing at his table and pulling up a chair. The general bore a look of astonishment, and that was probably all that would give Frederick a few more seconds of life. To be taken defenseless and unaware like this, even by some fluke after all his training, Frederick thought. But other, deeper wheels had already been turning from that same ninja training. Was the train ride enjoyable, General? Frederick asked in Russian, while unobtrusively searching for the wooden table flap levers underneath, the general's right arm tendons betraying his own reachings under the table for his trouser pocket, perhaps. "Not yet," came the reply, "for my precious golden train is now at the bottom of a mineshaft." "It would have been a fitting memorial for you, General," Frederick goaded as he lowered the table flap, the poison dart winging its revenge into it and sticking there. Frederick quickly pushed the table into the general, sliding it and him, pinning him to a wall. But the general was a sturdy man and pushed back hard, so Frederick tilted his end upwards and retrieved the dart, sticking it to the KGB man. By now, everyone had run out, and so Frederick headed for the kitchen, pulling the trash bag out of its can along the way. He put on a chef's hat and whites and went out the back, picking out his old papers and even taking the time to dump the trash into the dumpster, then went back into the kitchen to grab some tasty pastry. An astute investigator might eventually link Frederick's apartment fire to the killing of a foreign spy 10 minutes later, nearby. But all that any satellite video would show would be a cook emptying the trash and going back to work. And then perhaps that same cook or another going home where he could be interviewed later, for Frederick was now back out the rear, getting into someone's car, rolling it in neutral down a slight decline toward a dark area, for there was no key, then exiting out the other side into a bush. Maybe the police CIA satellite wasn't even around, but this was good practice, and furthermore, there could be other Russians in the vicinity. Although someone with influence might have half a chance of freeing him, Frederick saw no need to enter captivity, friendly or otherwise, wherein anything could happen, and slithered, then crawled, and then eventually walked into the night, through a treed park, then through another alley, catching a bus to the airport and not a taxi, for those drivers could often remember their passengers. He would make a report when he got where he was going or along the way, and it would trickle down to the locals to exonerate him.
Frederick found a flight to nowhere, Anchorage, Alaska, where then he boarded a stopover refueling flight from New York that was going to Tokyo via Guam, where he would get off, the best he could do on such short notice. He relaxed and began to sort it all out. Could there have been some kind of signal attached to his locker? No, for it was unlabeled and it was not the area that had blown up first. They'd thought him to be in his apartment. What was Burkov doing near the cafe? Probably oversight for his mission of retribution, and he had been astonished to see Frederick alive. Did they still want the tow information from him? No, for only the living can tell tales, and anything else of interest left in the building would not have survived the inferno, one expanded by the gas leak, which was probably just a cover. But how did they react so quickly to his arrival back home after his being gone so long? Every city has street cameras now, but they are crude, having to focus on an entire scene, and even so, his taxi had dropped him at the rear. Frederick closed his eyes and meditated for a bit. I've got it, he thought, snapping up. Burkov, obviously a greatly unbalanced person, seething over their old encounter, had camped or lived in the area with a small team, perhaps, waiting for the day that their prey would show. But they couldn't just hang around the complex day and night for months at a time. So, there must have been a special real-time facial recognition camera or two at the front and back entrances of the unit, although such a device was almost unheard of. What lengths does a man go to for revenge? But who has that kind of surveillance technology? Only the conspiracy, yes. When their centers had been overrun by the Russians from a tip by the ninjas, Burkov had madly appropriated some of the cameras unto himself. Then a signal to Burkov, and a few minutes to confirm, or even an automatic process if he was sound asleep. Frederick dozed, finally at peace. A few hours later, the pilot announced that Guam was closed to air traffic, and so they were diverting to Hawaii. What, thought Frederick, although that was his ultimate destination. Guam can't close, for most of these Great Circle flights need it for refueling, but it's also a large U.S. military base. 20 minutes later, Frederick noted an arc in the night sky that led back down to the ocean. It could only be a submarine launching a nuclear missile, for he'd already dreamt of its effects the day before.
China had been a few minutes from launch, but thought better of it when the U.S. finally went to DEFCON 1, but not Russia, something the future would not soon forget. Ground-based radar in Australia tracked a launch to the north. Don't let it be coming here, the tracker gasped. It wasn't. When Islamabad went up in a chain reaction, along with 11 other suspected large cities harboring terrorists, Pakistan launched on India, the only country they could reach, but who was also their old enemy for disputing their vision of the afterlife. However, India was ready and intercepted all, then countered, and soon Pakistan was no more, as well as the mountainous region between it and Afghanistan, it being destroyed now twice over, since the US had hit it as well. Meanwhile, Israel destroyed the beginnings of yet another Syrian nuclear site, as well as all of those in Iran. Silence followed by a relative peace. The Mayan calendar had near-ended, but not yet the world. Homo sapiens would likely continue, perhaps colonizing space someday, before he died off on Earth. As Frederick deplaned at Honolulu International on the Reef runway, crowded with jets without gates, and an Egyptian girl who had become very dear to him waved him toward a black helicopter. They were soon off to the bunkers of Nihao. A week or two later, a mini-nuclear winter arrived and began to restore some of the lost ice shelves. That was indeed close to a prophecy that nobody, rest his soul, had run into while lost in waves of time displacement on the CMBR trip. Perhaps some future things have already happened, destined but only in some general form or direction. Back at the tow center, they plugged in Frederick's updated formulas. The simulation would take about a month, so Frederick and his sweetheart took off to roam the island of paradise, albeit 3 degrees cooler in its average temperature, they building some pyramids in the sand along the way. They sat on the beach at the eastern shore of Oahu, where the road ended and turned to dirt before going off into the ocean, due to the rock protrusions. A familiar form beyond them sat in the sand and stared out to sea into the twilight, and so they ventured near. "Good evening, young Master Frederick," said the grand old man without turning around. "Hail to you, Grandmaster West. What brings you here?" "Well, I am here because of you, and you because of me." "How so?" "Well, here is a paper on which I've written what I was going to say next, so tell me then what it says before you open it." Frederick knew. "It will say, as you would have said, Frederick, as you know I've been busy lately with the nuclear crisis. But that's settled now, and so I've taken some time off myself, but I haven't forgotten you. I've read your complete and very detailed report, and would ascribe to it the fact that you went alone to spare any harm to others, and also, most significantly, because you knew yourself to be invincible in this mission, for you had seen yourself alive in the premonition of the future that had you testing your new formulas at the tow center." "Amazing," replied the Grand One. "Look to the paper now." "It is nearly word for word," said Frederick, much amazed himself. "Will the tests have a positive result? Did you see that?" "Yes, indeed they will. There is much more between heaven and earth than meets the eye.